All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Module 13. This time we're going to talk about response and recovery. So in the last module we talked about planning and preparedness. So that's what happens, prior to the incident. So now we're going to talk about what happens after or while. We're going to talk about response and recovery. Okay, like everything else in Homeland Security, response and recovery is a complex system and multi-tiered. Okay, all levels of government have to assess incidents, coordinate responses, uh, and implement post-incident response processes. So everybody's involved here, just like with everything else in Homeland Security. The federal government has developed this national framework to coordinate responses. Those are known as national planning frameworks. Um, so we talked a lot about planning, and planning kind of leads into this response and recovery. Right? We talked about how it's difficult to anticipate and predict what terrorists are going to do. Uh, varies from group to group, terrorist environment. Um, so what happens is you end up having reactive homeland security policy because it's hard to predict those things. Um, Oftentimes, policy reflects what happened last. So what happened last time. So that's usually what policy reflects. So they try to address new things, but it almost always happens that they address these things after they've been adopted and implemented. So, excuse me, those in counterterrorism are always kind of a step behind terrorists. All right, so the national planning framework is the national preparedness goal. Okay, so in synchrony with NIMS, uh, FEMA published 5 national planning frameworks. Each was dedicated to promoting preparedness within one of the 5 mission areas, which are prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. The purpose of these was to achieve the national preparedness goal, which is to achieve a secure and resilient nation with capabilities required across the whole community to prevent, protect against, mitigate, respond to, and recover from threats and hazards that pose the greatest risk. Each mission area was then further defined by a specific national planning framework. You have the National Prevention Framework, the National Protection Framework, the National Mitigation Framework, and so on and so on. Each document contains the core capabilities that are the action items that are needed to prepare or to achieve the national preparedness goal. So its core capabilities are the central implementation mechanisms um, for implementing the national planning frameworks, which, if done properly, should then achieve the national preparedness goal. Okay, these reflect an all hazards approach and this whole community collaboration that FEMA puts forward. Figure 13.1 does a good job in this area. All right, part of this response and recovery is Incident Command System, or ICS. So what we have here is a standardized on-scene incident management system. Some of the main categories or characteristics of ICS are standardization, we're using common terminology, command, which is it establishes command, it establishes transfer of command, it establishes what the chain of command should be, unity of command, planning and organizational structure, things like management by objectives, incident action planning, manageable span of control, facilities and resources, for the incident location of facilities, communications, integrated management, so having integrated communications, information and intelligence management, and then professionalism, we're talking about accountability, checking in, incident action plans, unity of command, span of control, resource tracking, dispatch and deployments, all those things are included under the incident command system. All right, so let's say we have a natural disaster, okay, and you hear a lot of times people talk about the president declared an emergency, or the president declared a disaster. So those are actually really important, these presidential declarations, to activate these coordinated interventions when some type of incident occurs. Okay, so it could be a terrorist incident, it could be a natural incident, it could be some kind of man-made disaster. Um, but these presidential declarations are what activates the coordinated interventions. So there's 2 different kinds. You have a presidential major disaster declaration, which is declared after catastrophes occur, which gives broad authority to federal agencies. Then you have emergency declarations, which trigger aid that protects property, public health and safety, and tries to keep those incidents from becoming catastrophic. The Robert Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act authorizes the president to issue those declarations. So how do those come about? Okay, so the declarations are usually only activated after local and state authorities request assistance. Okay, so local authorities are your first responders, so it's their job to quickly try to resolve this crisis if they can. If they can't, then they call on the governor and the state government for assistance. Okay, if state authorities cannot resolve it, then the governor may issue a formal request for a declaration from the president. So generally speaking, the president only does these declarations when the governor of a state explicitly asks them to do it. However, the National Response Framework does have a provision in it where the president may announce a disaster declaration without a formal request. It also allows, excuse me. So even though these disaster declarations, are usually what gets all the pieces moving. This framework also allows federal agencies to provide relief interventions without a formal presidential declaration. So obviously, the best way to do this is to go through, the regular processes to get everything moving. But there are contingencies in here where these things can happen without the normal chain of events. So having these provisions in, this is kind of a practical recognition. Sometimes extraordinary circumstances require immediate proactive intervention. Because remember we talked about bureaucracies and how things are slow and how they don't adapt and all those kind of things. So having these exceptional procedures in here allows for, if things are really, really bad, that things can move much more quickly than having to go through this whole process, getting a declaration or emergency declaration declared. All right, so the federal response, if you look back through time, the way the present system is a result of this progression of policy development. Okay, if you look back through, you could, just like things at the border we talked about earlier, you can tell who was in charge, what the threat environments at that time were. So as those threat environments change, the policies updated and changed as well. So the National Response Framework is part of this. So the third edition of that came out in 2016. So this National Response Framework provides this context for how this whole community approach is supposed to work. How is everybody supposed to work together? What is this supposed to look like? Okay, so this National Response Framework is kind of this national recognition that there needs to be some kind of systematic mechanism that promotes preparedness at every level of authority. Okay, this National Response Framework, that's what it does. Okay, it says how is everybody supposed to work together, and it says, look, we think this is important. At the federal level, we think this is important. We need to have preparedness at every level. All right, so the framework then consists of core capabilities. Okay, so these core capabilities are what are designed as like these practical elements that are going to help achieve the national preparedness goal. So under each of these core capabilities has critical tasks that response authorities are supposed to do. Now there's 15 of them. I'm not going to go into all of them. Make sure you go through them. Make sure you know what they are. Be able to identify them if you were asked about them at a later time. So to ensure that, to ensure the delivery of these 15 core capabilities, there's emergency support functions built into the framework. Okay, and those represent the federal coordinating structures that are used to achieve these core capabilities, and they're designed to be able to assemble resources from diverse sources and then package them together for critical disaster emergency relief centers. The framework also provides for unified coordination, and that describes how primary state, tribal, and federal incident management activities are to be conducted at the incident level. Okay, so that provides the support to personnel and agencies that are directly involved with operations at the incident site. It doesn't actually manage those operations, but it provides support for those operations. The state and federal incident management activities are directed by and coordinated by joint field offices, okay, which are a temporary federal facility that kind of provides a central location for coordination of the response efforts. So they have this temporary facility put up. It's a centralized location where people from the private sector, NGOs, all levels of government, everybody can go there to coordinate what they're going to do. Okay, the framework suggests that each joint field office is managed under the direction of a unified coordination group, which is comprised of senior state and federal leaders, and sometimes tribal, local, and private leaders. But how they're composed varies from incident to incident. Okay, there's no set like these people have to be in this unified coordination group. Okay, so there is some flexibility built in here. They want to have these things set up, but how those things are composed sometimes there is some flexibility as to what that's going to look like. All right, so that's kind of at the federal level. So now let's talk about the state level. The state is responsible for providing statewide emergency management support for local authorities. Okay, kind of like the federal level, the state really doesn't get involved usually until they get a request from local authorities. So it's kind of the same process. Local authorities have to request help from the state. The state doesn't just automatically go and provide provide support for those local authorities. State governments generally have state emergency management offices, and they are the ones that have homeland security coordination duties assigned to them. This is the state emergency management officers are kind of the state level equivalent of the Department of Homeland Security. The budgets for all this stuff are determined by the state and funded through either state funds or federal funds or some kind of combination of the two. Local authorities also have to do some response and recovery planning because remember, they're the ones that provide the immediate response, police, fire, medical. They're the first to deploy. Their responsibilities are generally contained in emergency operations plans. Local authorities benefit greatly from federal financial aid. Federal financial aid really assists them with equipment, with training, with all the things that they're going to need to be able to be this first line of responders. Because if you look at the Homeland Security enterprise, it's going to look like a pyramid. Okay, the local responders constitute a very large segment of this Homeland Security enterprise. If you think about how many local police, how many local fire departments, how many local EMS personnel, that's a very, very large segment of this Homeland Security enterprise. So the feds and the state really rely on them to be prepared and be trained and be ready to go in case something happens. All right, so we spent a fair amount of time talking about preparedness and planning and response and recovery. So the big question is, so we spent all this time, preparing for all these things, and response and recovery from a terrorist event could take a long time. It took a long time to recover from 9/11, but even something smaller than that, it could take a substantial amount of time to get everything back to kind of normal. So the big question really is, and this kind of leads us into the next module, is terrorism effective? Do the terrorists accomplish what they want? Well, to look at this, it really is kind of the eye of the beholder kind of thing. Whether terrorism is effective or not really is the eye of the beholder. So terrorist groups will often use very subjective considerations to determine whether or not their attack was effective or not. So if you want to evaluate terrorism's effectiveness, you really have to try to look at those events through that lens. Okay, us looking at it from our lens, it may not look like it's effective to us. Yeah, they might have done some things, but it really didn't do much. But that's not the point. The point is whether or not they think it's effective. Okay, so there's been a lot of reasons why they've declared success. Some of it's based simply on media and political attention. Did it get people stirred up? Did we get a lot of media coverage? Was this positive for us? Did we have an impact on a target audience or just whatever constituency we're championing? Did we affect people? Maybe we didn't really do much, but did it have an impact? Like, did we scare people? Did we terrorize people? Did we force some kind of concessions from the enemy? Did we disrupt the normal routines of a society? Did we somehow provoke the state to overreact, which then makes us look like a victim? Okay, so there's a lot of different reasons why groups may declare success when you're talking about a terrorist incident. So when you're looking at these things and trying to figure out why they're doing them and why they continue to do them, you really have to try to view them through the lens with which they are viewing their events. All right, that's the end of Module 13. Please complete your assignments for this module. As always, if you have questions, please let me know, and I'll see you in the next module.